In this improvisation video, we're going to talk about expanding the bass line, or what I call the advanced version of my Silent Night arrangement. You can find that here on the channel, so go check that out. And this is also part 2 of the improvisation series. In part 1, I talked about what a chord is, what a lead sheet is, what the symbols mean, all of that. So if you haven't seen that yet, or if you start to feel a little bit lost in this video, totally okay. This is all a beginner's guide. If you're just starting out in improvisation, you're in the right place. So if you need to, go check that video out and then come back and watch this one. All right, and I'll link it up in the description and at the end of this video. But what we're going to do is we're going to expand the bass line. So in part 1, we talked about improvising a bass line and reading a lead sheet and what these different chord symbols mean. Here I have them here on the page. All right, we're talking about these guys right here, okay? These chord symbols here, and I have them all circled. Yeah. Now, what I have down below. All right, so let's just go ahead here and have a clean sheet. And what I'm talking about when I say expand the bass line, this advanced one, is this line down here. Okay. All these notes here that you see on the page. And what you need to know about improvising a bass line, is that we're talking about expanding this chord name, this guy right here, into all the different parts. Now I keep using this word chord. If all of this is very brand new to you, and like I said, if you're a beginner, you're in the right spot. Chord and arpeggio for our purposes are interchangeable. All right, so if you've been playing your scales, let's just start with the key name here. We're in C major. Let's start with C major scale. I'm going to play the second octave. Or maybe you're going up the A string. Now, if you've played the arpeggio that goes along with it, you've been playing C major chords, all right? The arpeggio is a triad. We call it arpeggio when we're talking about those 3 notes, C, E, and G, in relation to the scale, but they are also a triad. They are a chord, right? And if you've been playing G major scale and G major arpeggio, then you've already been playing the notes from the G chord. So maybe you're playing the first octave G major scale, and the arpeggio that goes along with it. The arpeggio from the G major scale is the G major chord. Our other one, we're going to talk about 2 more chords here. We have the 4 chord. Whoops, getting a little too advanced there. F major chord, so F major scale. Maybe you're playing the other octave. And if you're playing the arpeggio, then you've been playing an F major chord. Now there is one chord on here. All right, the G7 chord, right? Which adds the 7th scale degree. That's that F natural. Right? Which adds so much wonderful character and a little bit of wonderful dissonance to the chord. All right, dominant 7 chord, very popular chord, okay? Now, all I've done in this quote-unquote advanced bass line is to expand the chord and play the other notes from the arpeggio. So if you're playing a very beginner, very basic bass line, as I mentioned in the previous video, you're going to stick to the letter names that you see there. You're going to play C, and you see a C chord, right? And you're going to play G, you see a G chord. If I want to elaborate, okay, create something a little bit more, I want to add to this, then I'm simply going to play, right, in time. When I see that C chord, let's go here and let me show you an example right here at the beginning. In the opening, we have C chord there and a C chord there. Now, in the first 2 options, I decided here in this version to go just straight up the arpeggio. C, E, G, C, E, G, like this, okay? We went. I could have just as easily and just as correctly chosen another order of notes from the arpeggio. I could have gone C, G, C. All right, and it would have changed the piece for better or for worse. I don't know. That's all matter of opinion, right? I decided to go with this version. But either version would be correct. I could even have gone C, E, C. And if you think about it, it makes sense why we can choose any note from the arpeggio on our cello. Think about a guitar that's strumming. It's playing lots of notes all at once. Or think about a piano that's holding several notes at once simultaneously here in the left hand while the melody plays. It's because all of the notes, all three notes from the chord, from the arpeggio, match what is going on with the melody. That is what is meant by the harmonization. This chord, all the parts of it line up with the melody that's on top. So I can choose any note I want from the arpeggio in theory. Now, sometimes there are other parts of the chord that sound more aesthetically pleasing to the ear. And that's just something that comes with practice, I think. The more you do this, the more you'll think, or the more you'll realize, okay, the tonic of the chord or the root of the chord sounds better in this spot. Or the third of the chord or the fifth or whatever sounds better in this other place. For example, here in the third measure. So we go, in the first two measures, we just went straight up the arpeggio. C, E, G, C, E, G. But then I decided to do something different here in the third measure and actually start the measure on the third of the chord and go E, C, back to E. Then C, G, C. Until we finally get to a new chord here at the beginning of the next phrase, the G chord. And notice what I did again, just went straight up the arpeggio. And then straight up the arpeggio again. Right? And so all I'm doing is this. Going dun 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 dun. C, E, G, dun dun dun. Okay? All the way up there. All of this advanced, realization of the harmony is just arpeggio notes. Are these the only notes you can play in the bass line? Absolutely not. But what I'm trying to show you is that if you just had a lead sheet, say you didn't have any of this bass line written out, you only had the chord names and your knowledge of the parts of the chord or the parts of the arpeggio. Okay, remember that. For this purpose, arpeggio chord, same thing. If you know your arpeggios, then you know these chords, okay? The only exception to that, all right, what I just said, is the G7 chord, okay? We'll talk about that in a later lesson, okay? But for now, and you don't have to play a dominant 7, you can just play a G chord where it says G7, all right? So if I just had these lead sheet symbols, I could just play arpeggios. All day long, or whatever, all right, over and over and over again. As long as I'm lining up, okay, my arpeggio as it's changing there on the page. Obviously, I can't play a C arpeggio when it's asking me to play a G arpeggio. I can't play an F arpeggio when it's asking me to play a C or a G arpeggio. That would not line up. It's got to match this root name, this letter name that's there on the page. And of course, lastly, rhythm, okay? The duration of what I do matters. So we're here in 3/4 in Silent Night, and I'm making my arpeggios, my chord changes, line up with the fact that we have 3 beats in the measure. Yes? So notice in the first measure, I went C, E, G. Not only does it line up with the arpeggio, okay, the notes, but it also lines up with the rhythm nice and clean, right? Or maybe, down once we get to measure 18 down here, okay, or 17 is the first time, decided to use some eighth notes. But again, I made it line up with the rhythm by going 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, and always landing on that root note down there, the G. I'll play for you. on. And so a lot of times, with a couple of exceptions, at the beginning of the measure, okay, on beat 1, I'm using the root of the chord. It makes it have a nice solid sound, a nice solid start to that part of the chord progression, okay? But that's what my ear likes. Maybe your ear likes something different. Maybe there's another setting. You're playing the Silent Night and you decide to start, you're playing it 3 or 4 times through, right? Because there's multiple verses. Maybe you don't do it the same way every time. Maybe the second time through, you want it to have a lighter, airy, whatever. So you start every measure, every chord change on the third of the chord, all right? And it makes it completely new and completely different because you're doing all the verses in whatever, service or wherever you're playing this, okay? You can make those choices once you have a firmer grasp of what notes go into the different arpeggios, and you don't have to rely so much on the realization. You can just play from the lead sheet from your own knowledge of the arpeggios and the chords, okay? Whew, kind of went off on a tangent there. Okay, this is so much fun. I love it so much. And there's, what's wonderful about improvisation and making this stuff up on the spot is that there are, in theory, limitless, okay, infinite numbers of possibilities as you mix these different notes and these different scenarios up. All right, so next time, as we continue through this series, through this improvisation series, we'll get into what other notes you might add, maybe some different chords you might see in a chord progression, and eventually we do want to start thinking about improvising a melody on top of the bass line, all right? Because, we want to feature the cello, right? I mean, everything's better with a cello solo, yes? All right. Check that video out right here. Eventually it will be here, part 3, all right? In the meantime, YouTube thinks you'll like this video right here.